The boat was
Isn't this
gone before either of
paradise?
them fully
It is
understood
with
what
you.
had happened.
This spear keeps
One
us
moment
safe.
the
I
water
feel
was
safe
calm
with
and
you.
gray and ordinary, and the next the rope had slipped its mooring in the sudden squall and the rental vessel was drifting backward into the fog off the coast of a small uninhabited island somewhere between the mainland and nowhere in particular. Thomas Briggs stood on the rocky shore and watched it disappear and felt the specific terror of a man who has a 9-year-old son at home waiting for him and no way to explain that he might not make it back in time for dinner. Or at all. Behind him, Catherine Voss sat down on a flat rock and looked at the fog with the expression of someone who was rearranging their expectations of the day. She was his boss. Technically she was everyone's boss, CEO of Voss Logistics, a company with 400 employees and a reputation for precision and control that she had built over 22 years from a single truck and a borrowed warehouse. She was not a woman who tolerated situations that fell outside her planning. And yet here she was, stranded on an island the size of a city block with her lowest-ranking operations employee, because they had both been on the supply inspection tour that morning and both stayed too long looking at tide pools while the guide had gone back to secure the boat and failed. Thomas pulled out his phone. One bar, flickering. He sent a text to his neighbor Dale that said stranded on small island near Kellerman Point, call Coast Guard, watch Caleb. The message showed delivered. He exhaled for what felt like the first time in several minutes. Catherine was watching him. How old is your son? She asked. He looked up, surprised she knew. 9, he said. His name is Caleb. She nodded like she was filing this somewhere important. You text him good night every night, she said. I've noticed you step out at 8 o'clock no matter what's happening in the office. Thomas didn't know how to respond to that, to the idea that she had noticed something so small and so private about his routine. He had worked at Voss Logistics for 3 years and exchanged maybe 40 words total with Catherine Voss, none of them personal. Yes ma'am, he said finally. He worries if I don't. She looked back at the water. My son was the same way, she said, and something in her voice changed key entirely, like a song shifting to a minor chord without warning. They built a small fire as the afternoon dimmed, using a lighter Thomas kept on his keychain out of an old habit he'd never explained to anyone, a habit born from years of being the only parent in the house and needing to be the kind of man who was prepared for things. Catherine turned out to be practically useful in ways that surprised him. She gathered wood without being asked and arranged it efficiently and didn't complain about her ruined shoes. They sat on opposite sides of the fire in the early dark and the island made its quiet sounds around them and Thomas thought about Caleb falling asleep in a house where no one was doing the voice for his bedtime story. She started talking around 9 o'clock. Not small talk, the other kind, the kind that only comes out when regular life has been temporarily removed and there's nothing left to perform for. Her son's name had been Patrick. He had died 4 years ago, 27 years old, a brain aneurysm that arrived without any warning on a Wednesday morning while he was making coffee in his apartment in Denver. She had been in a board meeting when it happened. She had been in a board meeting when the hospital called and she had stepped out into the hallway and sat down on the floor against the wall because her legs simply stopped working, and a janitor had found her there and sat beside her without asking any questions, and that small human gesture was the thing she remembered most clearly from the worst day of her life. Thomas said nothing because there was nothing to say and he understood that. He had lost his wife to cancer when Caleb was 4 and he knew that the correct response to certain grief was simply to stay in the room with it. She said, I made the company everything after Patrick died. I thought if I built it large enough it would fill up the space. She paused and looked at the fire. It doesn't, she said. In case you were wondering. I know, he said quietly. She looked at him across the fire. Yes, she said. I imagine you do. They slept in shifts, keeping the fire going. Thomas took the longer shift without saying so, letting her sleep more. At some point in the early morning hours, sitting alone with the fire and the sound of water and the distant hope of a Coast Guard vessel, he thought about how strange it was that the people you worked alongside every day could be almost entirely unknown to you. He thought about Catherine Voss walking through the office with her purpose and her reputation and the grief she was carrying around like something she'd learned to hold so still that nobody could see the weight of it. The Coast Guard arrived at dawn. 2 officers, efficient and kind, with blankets and coffee and a radio crackling with normal human noise. As they were being helped onto the rescue boat, Catherine touched Thomas's arm and said, Wait. He turned. She looked like she hadn't slept, which was accurate, and she looked like she had been deciding something for the last several hours, which he would later learn was also accurate. She said, I want to do something. For Caleb. Not as your employer, that's not what this is. She seemed to be choosing her words with unusual care. Patrick never had a father who showed up the way you do. His father left when he was 3. I used to wonder what it would have done for him, having someone who stepped out at 8 o'clock every single night because a child needed to hear a familiar voice. She stopped and steadied herself. I want to set up an education fund for your son. Full college. Whatever he wants to study. I've been meaning to do something meaningful with Patrick's memory, and I think this is it. I think this is what he would have wanted it to look like. Thomas opened his mouth and closed it again. The Coast Guard officers were politely looking elsewhere. He thought about Caleb, who wanted to be a marine biologist and had already filled 2 notebooks with drawings of fish he'd identified from library books. He thought about the college fund he added $12 to every week because $12 was what he had after the bills and the groceries and the small emergencies that arrived without scheduling. He thought about how he had never once asked anyone for help because asking for help felt like admitting that he wasn't enough on his own. He thought about a janitor sitting down on a hospital floor next to a woman who needed someone to stay. He said, I don't know how to thank you. She shook her head. She said, Patrick would have been 31 next month. Just, take care of that boy. That's all I'm asking. On the boat back to the mainland, wrapped in a Coast Guard blanket with bad coffee warming his hands, Thomas sent Caleb a message that said, I'm on my way home. Sorry I scared you. Everything is okay. He stared at the water and thought about how ordinary kindness moved through the world in ways that defied any kind of tracking. A woman tutoring a boy who built a foundation, a janitor sitting with a stranger, a man keeping a lighter in his pocket because the night was always a little unpredictable and someone had to be ready. Caleb's reply came back in 11 seconds. It said, I knew you'd be okay, Dad. I saved you some cereal. Thomas laughed until his eyes went blurry. There on the rescue boat in the early morning light, and Catherine Voss sat across from him and smiled like someone who had remembered, after a long time in the dark, what it felt like to do something that mattered.